Okay, here's a question for you. What does the Bible have in common with an ancient Greek romance novel? I know, it sounds kind of out there, right? But today, we're diving into this amazing puzzle where faith, fiction, and history all collide. We're going to uncover some deep and honestly pretty surprising connections between the stories we think of as sacred and the ones we usually just write off as entertainment.
So, picture this. In an ancient Greek story, a hero finds his lover's tomb totally empty, even though everyone thought she was dead. It's the start of a whole new adventure. Then, in a sacred text, a group of followers find their leader's tomb empty, and that moment, well, it changes everything. On the surface, these feel like they're from two different planets.
So that leads us to the big question for this whole explainer. What could these two stories possibly have in common? I mean, are they totally separate? Or could they actually share some kind of literary DNA that we've just been missing all this time? To even begin to answer that, we've got to first look at how we normally sort these ancient texts in our heads. Most of us, we put them into very, very separate boxes. And it usually looks a little something like this, right? In one box, you've got the sacred texts, the Bible. And then way over in another box, you've got ancient novels, like those popular Greek romances. We draw a big, thick line right down the middle. Yeah, this table pretty much sums up how we think today. We see sacred texts as history, as truth with a capital T, maybe even divinely inspired. But the novels? Nah, that's just fun stuff, pure entertainment dreamed up by some author. We assume there's zero overlap. One's fact, the other's fiction. But here's the kicker. What if the people actually writing and reading these things thousands of years ago didn't see that line at all? To really get how they saw it, we have to jump into their world for a minute. And in the ancient Greco-Roman era, that hard line we just drew gets incredibly blurry. Writers from all these different traditions were all kind of swimming in the same cultural sea. And here's the most important thing to get. It didn't matter if you were a Jewish scholar, a Christian evangelist, or a pagan novelist. If you were an educated person, you were pulling ideas from the same intellectual well. There was a shared understanding of what made a great, compelling story, no matter what it was about. This shared system was called paideia. You can think of it as the ultimate classical curriculum of the ancient world. Any educated person, like everyone who was anyone, studied the Homeric epics, they learned rhetoric, they read the same philosophers, and they all mastered the same literary tricks of the trade. This paideia created a common language for telling stories that everyone understood, no matter what they believed. And because they all had this shared education, they all had access to the exact same storyteller's toolkit. These were the established, super respected techniques you used to craft a narrative that was powerful and persuasive. One of the absolute coolest tools in this kit was something called mimesis. Now, hold on. This isn't plagiarism, not like we think of it. No, this was a highly respected art form, the art of creative imitation. An author would take a classic, famous text, like an epic poem, and use its structure and its themes as a kind of blueprint for their own new story. And doing this automatically gave their new work a ton of cultural street cred. Let's look at a real-world example of this in action. Okay, so first you've got Virgil's Aeneid, this huge foundational epic about the founding of Rome. Now fast forward a bit. The author of the book of Acts in the Bible has a pretty similar job. Tell the origin story of another new community, the early church. So what does he do? Well, a lot of scholars think the author of Acts used the Aeneid as a literary model, borrowing its themes and structure. It was a brilliant way to say, hey, listen up. This new story is just as epic, just as important as the story of Rome itself. But creative imitation wasn't the only tool in the box. These authors were also total pros at blending what we now call history and fiction. For them, these just weren't two separate things all the time. Yeah, you heard me right. Many ancient writers, and that includes the ones writing sacred narratives, were essentially creating historical fiction. Their main goal wasn't always to give a minute-by-minute report of what happened. It was to tell a story that could teach a lesson, explore big ideas, and maybe most importantly, create a strong sense of identity for their community. The Book of 3 Maccabees is a perfect example. It's a Jewish text from that era, and it's full of all these believable historical details. But its purpose wasn't to be a history report. It was an amazing story built to inspire a proud Jewish identity in a world totally dominated by Greek culture. Scholars actually call it a national romance. How cool is that? And this wasn't some weird, controversial idea. Even in ancient rabbinic thought, you see this deep understanding that a story doesn't have to be 100% factually true to communicate a much deeper religious or philosophical truth, you know? Sometimes a really well-told story, a fiction, is the absolute best way to get at reality.
Which brings us all the way back around to our empty tomb. I mean, just look at the journey of this one single story idea. Around 70 CE, boom, it's a huge moment in the Gospel of Mark. Then, just a few decades later, a really similar plot point, a heroine who disappears from her tomb is driving the story in a super popular Greek novel called Caliro. And then centuries later, Shakespeare pulls the same tool out of the toolkit for the tragic end of Romeo and Juliet. And look, the point here isn't to play who copied who. It's to see that for generations, writers from all different backgrounds were using the same powerful, resonant story elements. So, what do we do with all this? Does knowing about this shared literary world change how we should read these ancient texts? Oh yeah, absolutely. And I want to be super clear here. This isn't about invalidating sacred stories or trying to debunk them. It's actually the complete opposite. It lets us appreciate their authors for what they really were, brilliant literary artists who were at the top of their game. When you look at it this way, it just unlocks so much more. You see the authors as these highly skilled artists who are totally engaged with the vibrant culture all around them. It lets us have a richer, more complex understanding of the stories and really appreciate the incredible artistry they use to get their message across. So if there's one thing to take away, it's this. Sacred stories and ancient fiction weren't grown in separate, isolated greenhouses. They sprouted from the exact same literary soil. They were watered by the same culture and built with the very same storyteller's tools. And so, that leaves us with one last big question to think about. How does appreciating the profound art of a story change the way we understand the truth in that story? It's definitely something worth pondering. Thanks for joining me.